I was 74 when the black day came. My son, my blood, my pride, rested his hand gently on my shoulder and softly said, "Mom, it would be better for you in a special facility." He called it care. He said I was confused, forgetful, in need of supervision. They took my keys, quietly counted my accounts, gathered my documents and tucked them into briefcases with latches. Then, they signed something at my bedside and disappeared, as if I had died. 2 years, no calls, no postcards, no eye to eye. I lived among strangers, between gray walls and identical dinners. I listened to the drip of an IV in the room next door. I hid my memory in the folds of silence. And then, one day, they came back, but I wasn't waiting anymore. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Grace Milton, and I was 74 years old the day I realized something in my mind had started to flicker. It wasn't dramatic. No forgotten names, no lost keys, no wandering in confusion down unfamiliar roads. It was quieter than that. A word slipping just out of reach during a conversation. A grocery item I'd meant to buy and had walked right past. A moment when I opened the fridge and forgot why. I had spent my life teaching people how to navigate the mind's edges. I was a psychiatrist for nearly 4 decades, most of them spent in a small private practice in Madison, Wisconsin. I had seen what real cognitive decline looked like. I had held the hands of patients and their families as they faced it head on. I knew what it wasn't. I knew this wasn't that. Still, I took it seriously, so I started making lists. Not just grocery lists or appointments. I cataloged everything: where I left my keys, what medications I took each day, what conversations I had, even the weather. I kept a large leather-bound journal by the kitchen table, and each morning began with an entry. February 12th, 8:15 a.m. cloudy. Slept well. Took one pill, amlodipine. Coffee with cream. No sugar. Called pharmacy for refill. Left keys on hallway table. It wasn't fear that made me do it. It was habit. Precision had been my life's work. The difference now was that the subject of study had become me. My son Paul visited most Sundays. He lived a few hours away in Minneapolis with his wife Erica and their 2 teenage sons. He was always polite, always brisk, the kind of man who lived with a Bluetooth earpiece in one ear and a schedule broken into 15-minute increments. He had a good job, some kind of executive role in a tech company I could never quite understand. I only knew it kept him busy. He brought food when he came: frozen casseroles Erica had made, paper bags of groceries, sometimes pastries from a bakery he liked. He always seemed in a rush to get back. He'd say things like, "I don't want to get caught in traffic," or "I've got a call in an hour." I never took it personally. That was just who he'd become. On one of those Sundays, he noticed the notebook. "What's this?" he asked, flipping through it. I told him I was keeping track of things, that sometimes I misplaced details, and it helped me stay organized. He nodded, but his mouth tightened. He flipped a few more pages, then closed it. "You sure you're okay living here alone?" he asked. I told him I was fine. The following week, he returned with Erica. She walked through the house like a realtor, commenting on the stairs, the lighting, the clutter. She asked about my prescriptions, my routine, my insurance. It wasn't rude exactly, just clinical, measured. That night, I wrote in my journal, March 3rd. Erica asked about the rugs, suggested removing them. Paul was quieter than usual. Something has shifted. A few weeks later, Paul came alone. We sat in the kitchen drinking tea. He didn't touch his. He watched me instead, studying, evaluating. When he finally spoke, it was with that careful, practiced tone I recognized from my sessions with patients who were about to deliver bad news. "Mom," he said, I've been doing some research. There are some wonderful places now, not institutions, homes, warm, clean, supportive. You'd still have your space, but also help, just in case. I asked if he thought I wasn't managing. He said it wasn't about that. It was about being proactive. I smiled and thanked him for his concern. After he left, I sat at the table for a long time, staring at the page in my notebook. April 1st. Paul suggested I consider supportive living. No specific concerns listed. Motivations unclear. After that, things moved fast. Too fast. He began calling more often, asking for updates on bills, on my medical visits. Then he asked for passwords, just in case, he said. He offered to help with my finances. I declined. He insisted it was temporary. That night, I opened a second notebook. This one wasn't for symptoms or forgetfulness. It was for patterns. I wrote down every interaction, word for word when I could remember it. Dates, times, names. I scanned copies of every financial document, every piece of mail, every login change. I stored the files in a cloud folder under a name only I would recognize. I backed everything up twice. If there was one thing I understood better than anyone, it was that memory is power, and people only try to take it from you when they believe you don't know how to fight for it. I knew what they saw when they looked at me now. A woman who had crossed the invisible line into fragility, who had become a weight to shift, not a presence to honor. But I wasn't fragile. I was precise, and I was watching. It happened faster than I expected. One moment I was in my home, the next I was being wheeled into a room that smelled of bleach and linen, a clipboard resting on my lap, and a signature already scrawled where my name should have been. They called it temporary and transitional care. They said it was just until we figure things out. But I knew better. I had spent a lifetime decoding euphemisms. The facility was called Willow Pines, tucked behind a shopping plaza on the outskirts of town. It looked like a boutique hotel from the outside, stone facade, carefully manicured flower beds, a little fountain at the entrance. But once inside, it was unmistakably clinical. The halls were wide, the colors muted. Every surface was designed to be wiped clean. They gave me a room on the second floor, at the end of a quiet hallway. It was furnished in pale beiges and soft greens, the kind of colors meant to soothe without stimulating. There was a twin bed with rails, a narrow wardrobe, and a padded recliner positioned just beside a large window that overlooked a sliver of the parking lot, and beyond that, a line of gray-leafed trees. It wasn't unpleasant, but it wasn't home. The staff were kind in a practiced way. They smiled with their mouths, not their eyes. They addressed me as Miss Grace or Han, and their tone always carried the gentle lilt reserved for the very young or the very old. They asked if I wanted help dressing. They asked if I remembered what day it was. They wrote notes in binders when they thought I wasn't looking. I sat in that chair by the window every morning, pretending to read. But really, I watched. I observed the comings and goings of the staff, the rotation of nurses, the medication carts rolling by with the steady squeak of worn-out wheels. I memorized the schedule: breakfast at 8, group therapy at 10, lunch at noon, physical therapy at 2, dinner at 5, lights out by 9. It was a rhythm designed to flatten the days into something manageable. But for me, it was data. It was something to measure myself against. Each day, I recorded what I remembered: who visited whom, which patients cried during the night, which nurse skipped rounds. My journal entries became clinical again, like they used to be during my residency: detached, factual, intentional. I waited for Paul to visit. He didn't come the first week, or the second. I received a call from him on day 13. He sounded bright, busy, said he was letting me get settled, that he'd stop by as soon as work slowed down. I asked about the house. He said it was fine, that they'd started organizing some things. I could hear Erica in the background, laughing at something on the television. After I hung up, I closed my eyes and sat in the silence for a long time. The overhead light buzzed faintly, and outside, a crow cawed once, then flew off toward the tree line. I let the quiet wash over me, not as defeat, as recalibration. The residents around me existed in varying degrees of clarity. Some wandered the halls in slippers, talking to people who weren't there. Others stayed in their rooms, curtains drawn, eyes blank. A few still had sparks in them, sharpness in their tone, humor in their glances. But those were the exceptions. Most had surrendered to the routine. I refused. Every day I dressed myself. Every day I wrote. Every day I stretched my mind with crossword puzzles and read the local paper front to back, circling inconsistencies in red pen. I corrected the nurse when she misquoted the date. I reminded the therapist of a patient's allergy when she forgot to check the chart. They thought I was improving, that the medication was helping, that the environment was stabilizing me. They didn't know that I had never declined. They had assumed. Because I was quiet, because I was old, because I hadn't protested when they packed my things, when they drove me here, when they kissed my forehead and said, "It's only for a little while." But the truth was, I let them bring me here, because sometimes, to reclaim something, you first have to let it go, just long enough for the other side to believe they've won. And so I waited. Each day I sat in that chair by the window and let them believe their version of events. I listened, I remembered, and I planned. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I finally decided to ask for the documents. The light outside was bright and direct, casting angular shadows across the floor of my room. I had spent the morning as usual, in my chair by the window, knitting a scarf I didn't need, pretending not to notice the way the staff passed by with sympathetic glances. But that day, I felt something different stir in me, a kind of heat behind the ribs. It wasn't anger, it was readiness. I waited until after lunch, when the halls were quiet and most of the residents had retreated to their rooms for rest. The nurses used that lull to catch up on charting. I rolled my walker out of the room and made my way slowly to the nurses' station. Every movement I made was measured. I had learned to move just slowly enough to be underestimated, but just confidently enough to be left alone. When I arrived at the desk, Nurse Stephanie looked up. She was young, maybe 25, with a bun too tight and eyes that always searched your face for something broken. I told her I wanted to review my file. She blinked, hesitated, then recovered. She said she would need to ask her supervisor. I told her I would wait. And I did. I stood there for 13 full minutes while she made 2 calls and shuffled through 3 drawers. Finally, she returned with a large beige folder, the kind I knew too well from my own days in medicine. She placed it in front of me like it might bite. I carried it back to my room like it was made of glass. Once inside, I locked the door. I opened it slowly, page by page. At the top, in black marker, my name, Milton, Grace E. Date of birth, address, admission date. The first few pages were routine, notes from the intake nurse, dietary preferences, medication list, allergies, emergency contact information. I flipped through with increasing focus. Then I found the document, Power of Attorney. The page was dated 3 months prior. It listed Paul as my legal representative, health decisions, financial access, property management. My signature was at the bottom, but I hadn't signed it. I studied the handwriting. It was a near match. Someone had practiced. Someone who knew how I looped my M's and pressed too hard on the downstrokes. But I knew my own pen. I knew the pressure of my hand. I knew the slight tremor in my wrist when I was tired. This signature was too smooth, too clean. There were other documents, bank authorizations. letters from a lawyer I didn't remember meeting, consent forms for facility placement. Each one carried the same signature. Each one placed control firmly in Paul's hands. I closed the folder and placed it on my lap. I sat very still. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. What I felt was beyond those things. It was a cold clarity, like stepping out into a winter morning and letting the air freeze the inside of your chest. I had trusted him. That was the part that hurt more than the deception itself. I had let him into the soft, vulnerable places of my life. I had allowed him to become the keeper of my legacy, my choices, my home. And he had used that access like a scalpel, clean, deliberate, cutting away what he no longer wanted to deal with. I stayed in that chair until the light shifted across the room, until the folder in my lap felt heavy with everything it contained. Then I got up. I pulled my own notebook from the drawer, my journal, my record, my lifeline. I began copying every detail, dates, names, witnesses. I photographed each page with the small tablet the facility allowed residents to use for email and video calls. I uploaded everything to a private cloud account I had created weeks ago. One he didn't know existed. That night, I skipped dinner. I waited until the halls were quiet again and made my way back to the nurse's station. Nurse Stephanie was gone. The evening shift had begun. Nurse Ellis was on duty, a kind-faced man in his 40s who never rushed his words and treated every patient like they still had their full story intact. I told him I wanted to speak to the facility social worker. I asked for a private meeting. He didn't ask why. He just wrote it down and said he'd make it happen. I returned to my room and stared out the window, watching the last of the daylight vanish behind the trees. The chair beneath me felt different that night, less like a perch for waiting, more like a command post. I had the documents now, I had the proof, but more importantly, I had something Paul had assumed I'd lost. I had time, and I was going to use every second of it. The day I left Willow Pines was uneventful by most standards. There were no goodbyes, no farewell parties, no weeping staff clinging to my hand. It was just a Tuesday, cloudy, damp, and cool. The sky hung low over the parking lot like a wool blanket that hadn't been shaken out in years. I wore the same gray coat I had arrived in nearly 4 months earlier. It no longer felt like a shroud. It felt like armor. My bag was packed neatly, light enough for me to carry, but full enough to remind me that I wasn't leaving empty-handed. Tucked inside were photocopies of every forged document, legal notes from my meetings with the social worker and the ombudsman, my own meticulous timeline of events, and a letter from Judith, my new attorney. She had come to visit me 3 weeks prior, her heels clicking confidently on the tile as she walked through the halls of the facility like it was a courtroom. She didn't need a long explanation. One look at the documents had been enough. We had spent 2 hours together, and by the time she left, I had a plan, not just to leave, but to reclaim everything that had been taken in my absence. Nurse Ellis helped me to the car. He didn't ask questions. He didn't try to hide the relief in his voice when he wished me well. He had always suspected there was more to my story than the files suggested. Sometimes it doesn't take much, just one person who chooses to look a little longer. I took a cab to the city. I didn't want Paul or Erica to know I was gone. Not yet. I wanted to arrive in my life before they had the chance to prepare for it. The driver, a soft-spoken man in his 50s with a gentle laugh, asked if I was going home. I told him yes, and for the first time in a long time, it was true. When we pulled up to my house, I barely recognized it. The yard was still tidy, but it had lost its soul. The flowers were gone. The shutters were painted a sterile gray. The porch furniture was different, sleeker, more expensive, less lived in. It looked like a house waiting for resale. I unlocked the front door with the spare key Judith had helped me reclaim through the bank and property filings. The lock turned with a familiar click. The house greeted me with a cold silence. No scent of coffee, no hum of the radio, just air that hadn't been breathed in by its rightful owner for too long. Inside, everything was in its place, and none of it was mine. My favorite armchair had been replaced. The family photos had been taken down, swapped for abstract prints. The kitchen shelves were stocked with Erica's brand of cruelty-free everything. The coffee machine was new. The mugs were labeled his and hers. It was clear they hadn't just borrowed the house. They'd moved in, but the deed still bore my name. The accounts were being reviewed, and with every forged signature we'd uncovered, Judith had stacked a wall of legal firepower that they wouldn't see coming. I walked through the house room by room, reclaiming it without making a sound. I opened windows, let fresh air roll in. I pulled my blanket from the closet, the one Erica had tried to donate. I found the tea kettle, still there behind the juicer she'd never used. That evening, I made dinner for myself. Nothing elaborate, just lentil soup and buttered toast. I sat at the kitchen table and ate, while the late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, lighting the floor in golden rectangles. At 6:42 p.m., my phone rang. It was Paul. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before I answered. He asked how I was, said he heard from the facility that I'd checked out, tried to keep his voice even, tried to sound like he was in control. I told him I was home. He went quiet. Then he asked what I meant. I said it again. I'm home. He didn't respond right away. When he finally did, his words were careful, polite. He said he and Erica were planning to visit next week anyway, that they had something to discuss. He asked if I would be available. I told him I'd have to check my schedule. Then I hung up. I sat in the silence after the call, holding the warm ceramic of my teacup. The walls around me felt like they were breathing again, slowly expanding, as if recognizing me after a long absence. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't kicked and screamed. I hadn't even knocked on the door. I had just returned. And sometimes that is the loudest sound a person can make. The day they came back was bright and strangely warm for late April, the kind of warmth that hinted at summer, but still carried the cool breath of spring in the shadows. I had spent the morning in the garden, hands buried in soil, replanting the lavender that Erica had dug up last year. My knees ached from kneeling, and my hands were streaked with dirt, but I felt more alive than I had in months, maybe years. I was on the back porch, sipping a glass of lemonade, when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Not a delivery truck, not the neighbors. I knew that sound. It was too slow, too deliberate. Paul's car. I stood, walked calmly to the front of the house, and waited. The doorbell rang once, and I let it sit there in the air for a few seconds. Just long enough. Then I opened the door. There they were, Paul in a blazer too formal for a casual visit, Erica in a pastel blouse, clutching a reusable gift bag with tissue paper peeking out of the top like a badly staged theater curtain. They smiled, wide, rehearsed, brittle, like salespeople knocking on a stranger's door. They both said my name as if it were a question. I didn't answer. Erica stepped forward, offering the bag. She said it was just a little something, a welcome home present. Lavender-scented lotion, gourmet cookies, a book on aging gracefully. I took the bag and placed it gently on the table by the door without looking inside. They looked around the entryway, scanning the house like tourists who had returned to a familiar place only to find the furniture moved. Paul cleared his throat. He asked how I was feeling, said I looked well. He gestured toward the kitchen and asked if we could talk. I nodded once and stepped aside. They followed me in, sitting stiffly at the table, while I moved with unhurried precision, putting on the kettle, selecting teacups, choosing a plate for the cookies they had brought. The whole ritual was painfully domestic, absurd in its civility. When I finally sat down across from them, Paul leaned forward and began the pitch. He said he and Erica had been thinking a lot about the future, about transitions, about how important it was to ensure comfort and stability in the years to come. He said they wanted to revisit the estate plan, not because they were concerned, but because things had changed, because life is unpredictable. He used all the language I'd heard 1,000 times in my profession: soft manipulation, framed as concern, the language of caretakers who had long since ceased to care. I listened. I didn't blink. Then I asked the question I had rehearsed 100 times. Who are you? Their faces changed at once: confusion, disbelief, panic. Paul smiled awkwardly and repeated his name. I tilted my head as if hearing it for the first time. Erica said they were here to help me, that they were family, that they loved me. I looked at her with a slow blink. Then I asked again, "Who are you?" The silence that followed stretched thin and taut. Paul's voice cracked as he said, "Mom, don't do this." I smiled faintly, the way I used to with patients who were trying to control the narrative. "I'm sorry," I said slowly, carefully. "I don't recognize you." He looked at me then, really looked. His eyes scanned my face, my hands, my posture, and I saw the moment it clicked. Not that I had lost something, but that I hadn't, that I knew exactly who he was, and that I had chosen not to know him. Erica stood first. Her lips were pressed so tightly together they had turned white. She grabbed the gift bag and muttered something about miscommunication. Paul followed, slower, as if his legs weren't entirely cooperating. They didn't say goodbye. I watched through the front window as they got into the car. Paul sat in the driver's seat for a long time before starting the engine, his head tilted forward. Erica stared straight ahead. When they finally pulled away, I closed the curtain and returned to the kitchen. The tea had gone cold. I poured it out, made a fresh pot, and took it to the back porch. The sun was still warm, the air thick with the smell of turned earth and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. I sipped slowly and listened to the silence. Not empty silence, but the kind that follows a storm, the kind that tells you it's over. The letters came first, typed, formal, delivered in thick cream-colored envelopes that bore the sharp scent of cologne and legal ink. The first was from Paul, or rather from his lawyer. It used words like concern and clarification and hinted that there may have been confusion regarding certain legal filings. It said they were open to dialogue, to revisiting arrangements, and hoped to avoid escalation. I placed the letter in a drawer with the others I had begun collecting. The next came 2 days later, this one from a different attorney, one I didn't know. It referenced my state of mind, questioned my capacity, and implied there were individuals in her life who may be influencing her decisions. It was dressed up in legal politeness, but bled condescension through every line, as if the mere fact of my age invalidated my autonomy, as if having been quiet once meant I was voiceless forever. I didn't reply to either letter. I forwarded them to Judith instead. She read them, made a few annotations in red ink, and said they'd make excellent additions to the file. She smiled when she said it, a tight, knowing smile, the kind that says they made their move too early. Then came the calls, blocked numbers, voicemails left in hushed tones. Sometimes it was Paul, sometimes Erica. A few were from names I didn't recognize, friends of theirs, colleagues, distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years. All of them carried the same script: concern for my well-being, surprise at my recent behavior, hopes that I would reconsider certain actions. Each message followed the same pattern: sympathy laid over manipulation. They spoke as if I had drifted, as if I had wandered away from reason, as if my silence was not a choice, but a symptom. But I knew the truth. They weren't reaching out because they were afraid I was unwell. They were reaching out because they had realized I was no longer under control. One afternoon, two women showed up at my door. Strangers, mid-30s, blazers and clipboards. They said they were from Adult Protective Services, that there had been a report filed about a possible cognitive decline, that they were here to make sure I was safe in my environment. I invited them in with a smile. I made them tea. I answered their questions calmly, directly, without hesitation. I listed the date, the time, the last four presidents, and the name of every medication I'd ever taken. I showed them my journals, the cloud backup, the notarized letters from Judith, the documentation of forged signatures, the transcripts of voicemail threats, the withdrawal notices that had been reversed by the bank after our audit. By the time they left, they were flustered and apologetic. One of them said she admired my organization. The other said, "You're sharper than most people half your age." I thanked them both and walked them to the door. They never returned. Later that evening, I stood by the front window and watched the trees sway under the fading sun. The light bled orange through the blinds, casting thin shadows across the floor. The phone rang twice that night. I didn't answer. It stopped by the third ring each time. I knew they'd try again. Desperation comes in waves. I thought about all the times I had been dismissed in that facility, spoken over, redirected, told to rest, to trust, to sit down. I thought about how often women my age are treated like fragile pages in a book no one wants to read anymore. And I thought about how I had played into that belief, intentionally, how I had folded into their assumptions, let them believe I was fading, let them take what they thought was theirs. Because when people see you as weak, they stop looking closely. They stop preparing for the moment you stand up. I sat at my table and wrote another letter that night, not to them, to myself. A kind of record, a reaffirmation. I signed it at the bottom and sealed it in an envelope. Grace Milton, May 3rd. Not confused, not forgetful, not gone, present, watching, remembering. And I would keep remembering, even if they wished I wouldn't, even if it unsettled them. Because when they came to my door now, they weren't family. They were strangers, and I was no longer afraid of them. The unraveling began not with a confrontation, but with silence. Not mine, Paul's. For weeks, his voice had flooded my voicemail. His emails had cluttered my inbox. His lawyers had circled me like moths to a flame they never understood. But then, all at once, it stopped. No messages, no letters, no sudden visits or calls from unfamiliar numbers. At first, I assumed it was strategic, a pause, a regrouping, the eye of the storm. But then Judith called. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the satisfaction threading through each word. She had received a letter from Paul's attorney, an official notice withdrawing all pending inquiries into my competency. No explanation, no apology, just a retreat disguised as resolution. She said it was the cleanest surrender she'd seen in years. I hung up the phone and let the stillness of the house answer for me. That same day, I walked to the mailbox and found an envelope addressed in Paul's handwriting. It was thick, heavy with things he hadn't said out loud. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I placed it in a drawer beside the forged documents, the revised will, and the list I had once kept of every betrayal, every silence, every moment they'd left me behind. Let him live with the weight of his own words. Days passed. The neighborhood bloomed into late spring, everything green and flushed with warmth. The maple in the backyard filled out its canopy, casting wide pools of shade across the grass where I liked to sit in the afternoons. The breeze carried the scent of lilacs from the bush I'd planted years ago, the one Erica nearly chopped down to make room for her patio furniture. The life I had reclaimed became routine again, but not mundane. Each morning I brewed my coffee with quiet joy. I filled bird feeders, walked to the market, greeted the neighbors who still remembered who I was and hadn't once questioned my mind. I rejoined a book club, volunteered at the local library. I taught a short writing course at the community center on Saturday mornings. Just 8 people sitting in a circle, telling stories that mattered to no one but us. And then came the news. A friend from the library mentioned she'd seen Paul in the courthouse, said he looked thinner, nervous, said his name had been called in connection to a financial dispute. I smiled politely and said nothing. Later that week, I called Judith. She confirmed what I had already suspected. There was trouble, not dramatic, not criminal, yet, but enough to rattle the ground beneath him. A failed investment, a few misappropriated funds. One of his partners had filed a complaint. The firm was under audit. Judith asked if I felt vindicated. I told her I felt nothing at all. The truth was, watching someone fall doesn't bring peace. It doesn't undo what they did or repair what they destroyed. It simply removes the illusion that they were ever untouchable, that they were ever above consequences. I wasn't interested in revenge. I wasn't interested in watching him sink. I just wanted distance, a clean line. The sound of his unraveling was just that, sound, and I had learned to live without listening for it. One afternoon, Erica showed up at my door, alone. No flowers, no gifts, just her and a pale expression stretched too tight across her face. I didn't invite her in. She said she had come to explain. I told her I didn't need explanations. I didn't want context or excuses. I wasn't writing a psychiatric report. I wasn't looking for closure. I had closed the door the day I opened my eyes and realized how small their love had been. She said they never meant for things to go that far. I said that's what people always say when they've been caught. She looked at me like I was a ghost. I suppose I was. The version of me they buried had never truly died. She had just waited, quietly, until it was time to stand again. Before she turned to leave, she asked if I would ever speak to Paul again. I told her I didn't know who that was. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just nodded and walked down the front steps, her shoulders sagging beneath the weight of something she'd never bothered to carry before. After she left, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, sat in the sunroom, and watched the light shift across the rug. The silence was full, not empty. A silence earned, not imposed. The unraveling wasn't just his. It was mine, too. The unraveling of fear, of guilt, of the tight, constricting narrative that said I owed them anything just because we shared a name. That narrative was gone now. Thread by thread, I had pulled it apart. And what was left behind was simple. Me, still here, still whole. The house was never silent anymore, not really. It breathed with me now. The old wood floors creaked in familiar ways. The pipes groaned in the walls when the hot water started. The wind knocked against the front windows in the same rhythm it always had. It was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of presence, a lived-in quiet, grounded and honest. I had taken back every room piece by piece. I rearranged the furniture not to erase their memory, but to remind myself that this space was mine. I changed the curtains in the kitchen, planted fresh herbs in the windowsill, moved my reading chair into the sunniest corner of the living room. I bought new linens in soft greens and blues and donated the stiff hotel-style bedding Erica had chosen. Even my dog-eared books seemed to sigh with relief when I placed them back where they belonged, one by one, on the old shelves Harold built with his own hands. I spent more time in the garden than I ever had before. There was a satisfaction in dirt beneath my nails, in planting something and watching it take root. I grew tomatoes, basil, lavender, and a line of marigolds that ran along the fence like a ribbon of gold. Neighbors stopped to admire them. Some waved. A few even brought their dogs to sit and chat while I watered the plants. I had become part of the neighborhood again, no longer the woman who'd gone away for a while, but the one who had returned and stayed. Every morning I woke with the sun, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The rituals I kept were small but meaningful. A fresh cup of tea, the paper spread out across the table, a short walk to the corner cafe for a croissant I didn't need, but always enjoyed. I began writing again. Essays, mostly, pieces for a local newsletter, and the occasional letter to a friend I hadn't seen in years. I even joined a memoir writing group at the community center. I didn't write about what had happened, not yet, maybe never, but I wrote about life, about resilience, about finding yourself not in some grand revelation, but in the quiet act of choosing to stay. I had no desire to revisit the battles. The paperwork had long been filed, the estate settled, the false signatures invalidated. I was the legal owner again, with every account, every deed, every line of inheritance restructured with intention. There was no drama left in it, just fact, just law, and peace. I never opened Paul's last letter. It still sat in the drawer beside my journal, sealed and gathering dust. I had read enough of his words to last a lifetime. What I needed now wasn't explanation. It was air, space, room to grow. Some nights I would sit on the back porch with a blanket over my knees, the night sky stretching wide above me, stars pricking through the black like pinholes in a canvas. I'd think about how small things could break you if you let them. A missed call, a forced signature, a look from someone who no longer sees you. But I also knew that small things could restore you too. A flower blooming in a crooked pot, the sound of the kettle just before it whistles, the shape of a name said without agenda. Once I would have called this survival. Now I called it life. People often think home is where your family is, that it's blood, or tradition, or walls filled with laughter. But I had learned that home is something quieter. It's where your choices live. It's where you're allowed to be entirely yourself, without needing permission. Home is not just where you're loved, it's where you're remembered, especially by the one person who must never forget you, yourself. I was no longer waiting for someone to return, no longer hoping for an apology or an acknowledgement or even closure. I had found all of that in the way the afternoon light filtered through the oak tree out front, in the scent of clean sheets, in the way the front door clicked shut when I locked it from the inside and finally, knew I was safe. This house had always been mine, but now it was my home again, and this time I wasn't leaving.